My daughter-in-law called me low-class trash in the middle of my own anniversary dinner. Right there at the long oak table in the dining room of my country house. 42 years my husband and I lived in that house. 42 years building our life, our land, and the little restaurant business that paid for it all. And yet that night, Rebecca lifted her wine glass, smiled politely, and said those words like they were nothing. Some guests laughed nervously, others just stared down at their plates. My son Alex stood beside her. He didn't defend me, he didn't even look at me. That was the moment something inside me went very quiet. Because Rebecca didn't look embarrassed. Not even a little. She looked comfortable, confident, like someone who already believed this house, this land, and the 5 diners my husband and I built from scratch were already hers, and that's when I realized something wasn't right.
Welcome to Life Voices, where family drama turns into late-life justice. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.
The house sits on 12 acres just outside Austin. My husband Daniel built most of it himself. Not the fancy parts, not the stone patio or the big windows. Those came later when the diners started doing well. But the bones of the house, the beams, the porch, the long dining room where we had that anniversary dinner, those were his hands. I still remember the first winter we spent there. No curtains yet, no proper driveway, just a small wood stove and a mattress on the floor. But Daniel used to say something that always stayed with me. Land is patient, he would tell me. If you work it long enough, it takes care of you. And for 40 years, it did. The first diner opened 10 minutes down the road. Just 6 tables and a counter. I worked the register. Daniel cooked. Some nights we barely made enough to cover groceries. Other nights we locked the door and danced in the empty dining room because we had sold out of pie. Slowly, 1 diner became 2. Then 3. Eventually 5. 30 people working for us. Families depending on those paychecks. But Rebecca never asked about the employees. She never asked how we built the business. She asked about something else. Ownership. I remember the first time she visited the house after she and Alex got engaged. She walked through every room slowly, not admiring the place, studying it, running her fingers across the oak railing Daniel installed himself, looking out across the land. Then she asked, very casually, "Is the property in your name?" I laughed at first. I thought she was just curious. But she kept asking questions. Quiet ones. The kind people ask when they think you won't notice. Do you have a trust set up? Who manages the restaurant accounts? Are the diners owned under a company or personally? She asked those questions more than once. And after a while, my son Alex started asking them too. That's when something inside me tightened. Because Alex had never cared about paperwork before. When he was younger, the only thing he ever wanted from the diners was free milkshakes. But suddenly he was talking about structure, about long-term planning, about future management of the business, all while I was sitting right there in the room. One evening we were sitting on the back porch. The sun was going down over the fields. Alex leaned back in the chair and said something that stayed with me. "Mom, you should probably think about organizing the estate." Estate. That word sounded strange coming from my own son. I asked him what he meant. He shrugged. Just planning ahead, making things easier for everyone. Everyone. That word hung in the air. Because I realized something uncomfortable. They weren't talking about my future. They were talking about what happens after me. And that's when I started noticing the small things. Rebecca opening cabinets in the kitchen like she was mapping the house. Rebecca taking photos of the property during family barbecues. Rebecca asking the same question 3 different ways. How valuable do you think this land is now? I didn't confront her, not then, but the more she spoke about the future, the more I felt like I was slowly disappearing from the present. And one night, something happened that made everything suddenly make sense. And one night, something happened that made everything suddenly make sense. It was about 2 weeks after that anniversary dinner. Most of the guests had already left. The house was quiet again. Only the soft lights in the garden were still glowing outside the windows. I couldn't sleep, so I walked down the hallway toward Daniel's old study. That room still smells like him. Coffee, wood polish, and the faint scent of motor oil from the tools he used to keep in the garage. As I passed the door, I heard Rebecca's voice. Low, careful. She was inside the study. At first I thought she was talking to Alex. But when I stopped near the door, I realized she was on the phone. She owns everything personally, Rebecca said. Her voice sounded calm, almost businesslike. I stood very still. The land, the house, and all 5 diners. There was a pause. Then she laughed quietly, not a warm laugh, a calculated one. Yes, she continued, it's even better than we expected. My stomach tightened. I knew I shouldn't listen. But something told me to stay right where I was. Rebecca lowered her voice. Once Alex signs after the wedding, control becomes very simple. Another pause. Then she said the sentence that made my blood run cold. The Reed estate will practically transfer itself. I felt the air leave my lungs. Estate, transfer, control. Those weren't family words. Those were business words. And suddenly the insult at the dinner table made a lot more sense. Rebecca never saw me as family. She saw me as an obstacle. And that was the moment I realized something else. Rebecca hadn't married my son for love. She had married him for everything my husband and I had built. But what Rebecca didn't understand yet was that I had spent 40 years running a business. And when someone tries to take your business, you pay very close attention. For the next few days, I didn't say a word to anyone. Not to Rebecca, not to Alex. And that silence made Rebecca uneasy. You can learn a lot about people when you stop reacting. At breakfast, she watched me carefully. When we walked through the garden, she stayed close, asking small questions that sounded harmless. So, have you ever thought about selling the land someday? I smiled politely. No. She nodded, but I could see the disappointment flicker across her face. Later that week Alex came by the house again. He said he wanted to talk about something important. We sat in the dining room where everything had started. The same long oak table. The same chairs Daniel had chosen years ago. Alex placed a folder on the table. Rebecca sat beside him. She folded her hands like she was in a business meeting. Inside the folder were documents. Legal ones. I didn't even need to read them to understand what they were. Rebecca slid them slightly closer to me. It's nothing complicated, she said in a soft voice. Just temporary financial management. I looked at Alex. Temporary for what? Rebecca answered before he could. Just until everything is properly structured. Structured. Another business word. Alex finally spoke. Mom, it's just easier if I help manage the accounts for a while. Help manage. I opened the first page. The papers gave Alex access to the restaurant accounts, authority over property decisions, and partial control of the business. I looked up slowly. Rebecca kept smiling, the calm kind of smile people use when they believe they've already won. Mom, Alex said, don't make this difficult. That sentence hurt more than the papers. Don't make this difficult, as if protecting the life Daniel and I built was an inconvenience. I closed the folder, folded the papers neatly, then I pushed them back across the table. I'll think about it, I said. Rebecca's eyes narrowed for just a moment. Not long enough for Alex to notice. But I saw it. She had expected an argument. Or fear. Instead, I gave her silence. And silence can be a very uncomfortable thing for people with secrets. That evening Rebecca walked through the house again. I noticed she paused longer in the dining room, looking around the space, almost measuring it with her eyes. But by then I had already made a decision. Because Rebecca didn't know something about me. Before the diners, before the land, before the big house, Daniel and I had spent 20 years learning how to survive when people tried to take advantage of us. Running restaurants teaches you something about human nature. You learn to recognize the difference between someone who wants to build something and someone who only wants to take it. So that night I made a phone call to a woman named Tessa Monroe, a private investigator. I had met her years ago after one of our managers tried to steal from the business. She answered on the third ring. Mrs. Reed, she said. I haven't heard from you in a long time. I looked out the kitchen window at the dark fields stretching beyond the house. No, I said quietly. But I think it's time we talk again. There was a short pause. Then Tessa asked one simple question. What kind of problem are we dealing with? I thought about Rebecca, about the phone call I overheard, about the papers on the dining room table, and about the way she looked at my house. Like it already belonged to her. I'm not sure yet, I said. But I think someone might be planning to steal my entire life. Tessa didn't answer right away. She was the kind of person who didn't rush her words. Finally she said, "That's a serious sentence, Mrs. Reed." "Yes," I replied. "It is." She asked me a few simple questions. Names, dates, how long Rebecca had been in the family. I told her everything I knew. Not much, but enough. When I finished, Tessa said something that stayed with me. "People who chase inheritances usually have practice." I felt my stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said calmly, "very few people try something like this for the first time." The kitchen felt suddenly colder. I looked around the room Daniel and I had shared for 4 decades. The old cabinets, the worn wooden floor, the coffee maker that had been running every morning since 1987. Everything in that room had been built slowly, honestly, and the thought that someone was quietly planning to take it made my chest feel heavy. "What do you need from me?" Tessa asked. "Start with Rebecca," I said. "Her background, her work history, everything." There was another pause. "All right," Tessa said. "But Mrs. Reed, if what you suspect is true, we may find things you don't like." I thought about Rebecca's voice in the study. The Reed estate will practically transfer itself. "Then it's better I know now," I said. Tessa agreed. "Give me a few days." When the call ended, the house was silent again. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees. For a long time I stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the land Daniel loved so much. Rebecca believed she had already won. She believed I was just an old woman who didn't understand what was happening. But she forgot one small detail. You don't build 5 restaurants? You don't survive 40 years of business without learning how to recognize a quiet war when it begins. And something told me, Rebecca had just started one. 3 days later, Tessa called me back. Her voice sounded different this time. More serious. "Mrs. Reed," she said, "I think you were right to call me." I was standing in the pantry of the first diner when the phone rang. The smell of fresh coffee and fried bacon filled the air. Morning rush. Waitresses moving fast. Cooks calling orders. For a moment I almost forgot why I had hired her. Then Tessa spoke again. "Rebecca isn't exactly who she says she is." My hand tightened around the phone. "What do you mean?" "I mean the name Rebecca Collins doesn't show much history," Tessa said. "Not before about 7 years ago." 7 years. That was long before she met Alex. "People don't usually appear out of nowhere in their 30s, Tessa continued. "Unless they're trying to start over." I stepped outside the diner. The Texas sun was already warm. Cars moving slowly along the road. Normal life. But my heart was beating faster now. "What did you find?" I asked. Tessa exhaled quietly. "The name Rebecca Collins is real. But it isn't her original name." A cold feeling moved through my chest. "What was it before?" "Rebecca Cole," she said. "And before that, possibly Rebecca Lane." I didn't speak. Tessa continued. "I'm still confirming some records, but the pattern is interesting." "What pattern?" "Relationships," she said. "Engagements. Marriages. Each time with men connected to family money or property." My throat felt dry. "How many?" "3 confirmed," Tessa replied. "Possibly 4. For a moment I couldn't hear the traffic anymore. Just the sound of my own breathing. "And what happened to those relationships?" I asked. "Financial transfers," Tessa said. "Property agreements. Joint accounts." She paused. "Then divorce or disappearance." A truck roared past on the highway. Dust lifted from the roadside. Everything around me looked exactly the same. But inside, something had shifted. Rebecca hadn't just chosen my son. She had selected him. "Does Alex know any of this?" I asked. "I doubt it," Tessa said. "People like Rebecca are very careful about the stories they tell." I closed my eyes for a second. My son had always believed the best in people. Daniel used to say Alex had a soft heart. That kind of heart can be a beautiful thing. But it can also make someone an easy target. "There's more," Tessa added. I felt my stomach tighten again. "Go ahead." "We located a storage unit rented under another name connected to Rebecca." "What's inside?" "Documents," Tessa said. "Old identification cards, contracts, personal files." My voice lowered. "Files?" "Yes." Another pause. "And one folder that concerns you." My pulse quickened. "What does it say?" Tessa spoke slowly. "The label on the folder reads, Reed Estate." For a few seconds I couldn't move. Reed Estate. My house. My land. My business. all sitting inside a stranger's storage unit like a project she was planning. "What's in the file?" I asked. "We haven't opened it yet," Tessa said. "But based on the other folders." She stopped. "Go on," I said quietly. "It looks like Rebecca prepares detailed plans before she marries someone." Plans. The word sounded clinical, cold, like blueprints for a building. Except the building in this case was my family. "When can you access the unit?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning," Tessa replied. "I'll call you as soon as we know more." The line went silent. I stood there beside the diner for a long moment. Across the road the fields stretched wide and green. Daniel used to say land remembers everything. The good years, the bad years, the people who cared for it, and the ones who tried to take it. Rebecca believed she had found the perfect target. An aging widow, a trusting son, a valuable estate, but what she didn't understand yet was that I was no longer guessing. Now I knew exactly what kind of game she was playing. Rebecca believed she had found the perfect target. An aging widow, a trusting son, a valuable estate, but what she didn't understand yet was that I was no longer guessing. Now I knew exactly what kind of game she was playing. And once you understand the game, everything changes. That afternoon I stayed at the diner longer than usual. I walked through the kitchen, checked the supply room, spoke with the cooks. Normal things I had done for years. But that day I was looking at everything a little differently. The stainless steel counters, the old coffee machine Daniel bought secondhand when we opened our first place. The framed photo of the original diner hanging near the register. Daniel standing outside the door with flour on his shirt and the biggest smile I had ever seen. That little building had started everything. From that first diner came the second, then the third, eventually 5, all built slowly, no shortcuts, no tricks, just long hours and stubborn determination. Rebecca had looked at those diners like they were numbers on paper. Assets, transferable property, but she had never stood behind the grill at 5 in the morning. She had never watched Daniel fix a broken freezer at midnight so the staff wouldn't lose a day's pay. She had never understood what those places really meant. To her they were just pieces of a future inheritance. To me, they were my life. And standing there in the middle of the diner that day, I realized something very clearly. Rebecca thought she was planning the end of my story. But in reality, she had just started a war she didn't even see coming. The next morning, Tessa called before 8. I was in the kitchen, still in my robe, holding a cup of coffee I hadn't even tasted yet. "We opened the storage unit," she said. I sat down slowly. "And? It's worse than we thought." Outside the window the morning looked peaceful. Inside, my chest felt tight. "Tell me." "There are fake driver's licenses," Tessa said. 2 passports under different names. Old bank records. Engagement photos with different men. Legal drafts for property agreements. My fingers tightened around the cup. And folders. How many? 7. 7 lives. 7 plans. In mine? I asked. The one labeled Reed Estate is the thickest. I stared at the kitchen table. What's inside? Property records, land value estimates, layouts of your house, financial summaries of the diners, notes about Alex, notes about you. My voice dropped. What kind of notes? Your schedule, your habits, which employees are loyal to you, and something called emotional pressure points. For a moment I couldn't speak. To Rebecca, we weren't people. We were strategy. There's also a timeline, Tessa continued. Engagement, marriage, gradual financial integration, access to accounts, then pushing for estate planning. So it had all been planned. Every question, every smile, every helpful suggestion. And Alex? I asked quietly. Nothing here suggests he knows. That hurt more than anything else. Because it meant my son hadn't become cruel. He had simply been managed. Handled by someone who knew exactly how to do it. There's one more thing, Tessa said. In the file there's a document titled Post-Marriage Control Structure. It explains how Rebecca expected to gain control of your business within a year. A year. That was how long she thought it would take to own everything Daniel and I had built. I stood and walked to the window. The oak trees in the garden were moving in the breeze. Daniel planted those trees himself. Tessa, I said slowly, I think I know where this ends. You do? The wedding. Rebecca had insisted on holding it here. In my garden. Under those oak trees. At the time I thought it was bold. Now I understood. She didn't want a wedding. She wanted a victory party on the property she believed would soon be hers. You want the truth revealed publicly, Tessa said. Yes, that's the safest way, and the clearest. After we hung up, I made several calls. My attorney, my bank, the business accountant. Accounts were locked down. Authorizations were changed. Documents were secured. Quietly, carefully. Most importantly, Rebecca would believe everything was still going exactly as she planned. That afternoon Alex came by the house. He found me trimming roses in the garden. Mom, he said, Rebecca thinks you've been distant. Have I? I asked calmly. He shifted uncomfortably. She's just trying to help organize things. Organize. That word again. Alex, I said, do you think Rebecca would still be here if I had no house, no land, and no diners? He stared at me. For the first time in weeks, he didn't have an answer. He left soon after. Confused. Uneasy. That evening Rebecca called. Her voice was warm and cheerful. She wanted to talk about the wedding. Flowers, lighting, table settings. I answered politely. I told her the garden would look beautiful in spring. I told her the terrace lights were working again. I told her the day would be unforgettable. And I meant that, because by then the plan was already moving. Quietly, carefully, just the way Rebecca liked to operate. The only difference was this time. The plan wasn't hers, it was mine. Rebecca kept talking for another 10 minutes. About flowers, about guest seating, about how the garden would look so elegant, with white lights hanging from the oak trees. I listened quietly. Every now and then I said something polite. Yes, that sounds lovely. I'm sure the guests will enjoy that. But while she was speaking, I was thinking about something else. I was thinking about the storage unit. About those 7 folders. About the file with my name on it. Rebecca believed she understood this house. She believed she understood my family. But she had made one very serious mistake. She had studied my money. She had studied my property. She had studied my son. But she had never taken the time to study me. And that was going to cost her. Before we ended the call, she said something that almost made me smile. I really want this day to be perfect, she said sweetly. It will be, I told her calmly. Because by then I already knew something she didn't. The wedding in my garden was going to be perfect. Just not in the way she expected. The wedding day arrived on a warm Saturday afternoon. The kind of afternoon Daniel used to love. Soft breeze, clear sky, the oak trees in the garden moving slowly in the sunlight. White chairs had been placed across the lawn. Long tables stood under strings of lights Rebecca had insisted on hanging the night before. Guests arrived slowly, parking along the long gravel driveway that led to the house. Friends, neighbors, business partners, even a few reporters from the local paper Rebecca had invited to cover the romantic country wedding. She wanted attention. She wanted people to see the moment she believed would mark the beginning of her new life. I stood on the back terrace watching everything quietly. My blue dress moved gently in the breeze. Several guests came up to greet me. They congratulated me, told me how beautiful the property looked. I thanked them politely. Rebecca appeared from inside the house about 20 minutes later. White dress, perfect makeup, confident smile. She looked like a woman who believed everything had gone exactly according to plan. When she saw me standing near the terrace, she walked over. Isn't it beautiful? She said, gesturing toward the garden. It is, I answered. Her eyes moved across the lawn, across the oak trees, across the house. She was already imagining it as hers. Alex stood near the guests, talking with a few friends from the diners. He looked nervous, but happy. Poor boy, he still thought this was just a wedding. Rebecca leaned slightly closer to me. You know, she said quietly, this place is going to make an incredible family estate someday. Someday. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said, it will. Music started playing near the garden path. Guests began taking their seats. Rebecca walked toward the aisle where Alex was waiting. She looked radiant, confident, completely certain the future was hers. But just before the ceremony began, something unusual happened. 3 men stood up from the back row of chairs. None of them were part of the guest list. The first man stepped forward. He looked directly at Rebecca. Her smile froze. The second man moved beside him. Then the third. Murmurs moved through the crowd. Rebecca's face slowly lost its color. She recognized them, all 3. Alex frowned, confused. Rebecca? He asked quietly. She didn't answer, because at that moment the large screen beside the terrace turned on. I had asked the event company to install it the day before. Rebecca had assumed it was for a wedding slideshow. Instead, the first image appeared. A passport, Rebecca's photograph, but under a different name. Then another document, another identity, another engagement photo. Each man standing in front of the guests had once been promised the same future Rebecca promised my son. Marriage, shared property, a life built on trust. The crowd had gone completely silent. The second image showed bank transfers. The third showed copies of the folders from the storage unit. The one labeled Reed Estate appeared last. Rebecca's breathing became shallow. Her confidence was gone now. Completely. Alex turned slowly toward her. "What is this?" he asked. She looked at him but couldn't speak. Then 2 police cars appeared at the front gate of the property, their lights flashing quietly through the trees. Guests began whispering. Someone stood up. Rebecca looked at me. For the first time since I had met her, there was no confidence in her eyes, only fear. The officers walked calmly across the lawn. One of them spoke her name. Not Rebecca Collins, another name entirely. They took her gently but firmly by the arm. She didn't resist. As they led her past me, she stopped for a moment. She leaned slightly closer. "You're not so different from me," she whispered. I looked at her calmly. "No," I said, "we are very different." She was taken down the gravel driveway, past the oak trees, past the house she believed would soon belong to her. When the police cars disappeared down the road, the garden was completely silent. Alex stood in the middle of the aisle, pale and shaking. Guests slowly began to understand what they had just witnessed. I walked down the path toward my son. He looked at me like a child again. Confused, hurt, lost. And that was the moment I knew the hardest part of this story was not Rebecca. It was what came after. Alex stood there for a long moment. The music had stopped. The guests didn't know whether to stay seated or leave. Everything that had looked like a perfect wedding just minutes earlier now felt strangely quiet. Finally Alex spoke. "Mom, did you know?" His voice was low, not angry, just stunned. I nodded slowly. Yes. He rubbed his face with both hands like he was trying to wake himself up from a bad dream. "I don't understand," he said. "How long?" "Long enough," I answered. Around us, people were beginning to talk again. Soft whispers, confused conversations, but Alex wasn't listening to any of them. He was staring at the empty driveway where the police cars had disappeared. "She lied about everything," he said. "Yes," I replied gently. He looked back at the house, at the garden, at the oak trees Daniel planted so many years ago. For the first time that day, he looked small again. Not like a groom, like a son who had just realized how close he had come to losing everything his parents built. And that realization hurt him far more than Rebecca's arrest ever could. The guests slowly began to leave the garden. Not loudly, not with drama, just quiet conversations and uncomfortable goodbyes. Some people shook my hand. Some avoided looking at me at all. The reporters Rebecca had invited were standing near the driveway, whispering to each other and writing notes. I knew tomorrow the town would be talking. But that didn't matter anymore. The truth had already been seen. Alex sat down heavily in one of the white chairs near the aisle. Still wearing the suit he had chosen for his wedding day, he looked like someone who had just walked out of a storm. I walked over and sat in the chair beside him. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Finally he asked a question that sounded almost like a child again. How did I not see it? I didn't answer right away. Because that question deserved an honest answer. Because you loved her, I said. He nodded slowly. And because she knew exactly how to use that. Alex stared out across the empty lawn. The wind moved gently through the oak branches above us. I told you not to make things difficult, he said quietly. I remembered that moment at the dining room table. The folder, the papers, Rebecca sitting beside him with that calm smile. Yes, I said, you did. He swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Those words took effort for him. I could hear it, but apology was only part of what he needed to say. What happened to you? I asked gently. He looked confused. What do you mean? You used to trust your instincts, I said. When you were young you could tell when someone wasn't being honest. He rubbed his hands together slowly. I guess I stopped paying attention. Maybe he had, or maybe Rebecca had simply been better at the game than he was. After a while he stood up and looked toward the house. All those papers, he said. The business accounts, the estate plans? His voice trailed off. Yes, I said. They were real. And you knew? Yes. Another long silence. Then he asked the question I knew would come. Are you going to forgive me? The evening light was beginning to fade across the fields. Daniel used to love this time of day. Said the land looked honest in evening light. I thought about my son. About the boy who once helped wash dishes in the first diner. About the young man who brought me tulips every spring. And about the man who had placed legal documents on my table and asked me not to make things difficult. I don't think forgiveness is the right word, I said finally. He frowned slightly. Then what is? Understanding. He waited. Rebecca didn't change who you are, I continued. She only revealed how easily someone can guide a person who stops asking questions. Alex looked down at the ground. The gravel path was covered with small white petals from the wedding flowers. I feel like an idiot, he said. That's a painful but useful feeling, I replied calmly. He let out a quiet breath. What happens now? I looked across the garden. The chairs were being stacked. The lights were slowly turning on as evening settled in. The same thing that always happens, I said. We keep building. He looked at me again. But differently this time. He nodded slowly. For the first time that day, his shoulders relaxed slightly. We walked back toward the house together. The oak trees moved softly above us. The same trees Rebecca had imagined decorating for her new life. The same trees Daniel planted when we first bought the land. Some things survive storms. Some things grow stronger because of them. And as we reached the porch, Alex stopped and said something I had not heard from him in a long time. Mom, what can I do to fix this? I looked at him for a moment. Then I gave him the only honest answer. Start by remembering who you were before someone tried to manage your life. He nodded, and for the first time since that terrible anniversary dinner, I felt like my son might actually be coming back. Alex stood quietly on the porch beside me. The garden lights were glowing now, soft and warm across the lawn. Workers were clearing the last of the chairs. The place that had almost become the scene of a celebration now looked like something else entirely. Like a stage after the play is over. Alex leaned his elbows on the railing and stared out across the land. I keep thinking about what she said, he admitted. What part? I asked. That everything would be easier if I handled the business, he said slowly. She made it sound like I was protecting you. I nodded. That's how manipulation works, I said. It dresses itself up as help. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked something that surprised me. Were you scared? I thought about that honestly. A little, I said. But not of losing the land. He looked at me. Then what? Of losing you. That seemed to hit him harder than anything else that had happened that day. He looked back toward the oak trees again. For a long time we just stood there together in silence. Finally Alex said something very quietly. I don't want to be that man again. And in that moment I understood something important. Rebecca hadn't just been trying to steal my estate. She had almost stolen my son. But sometimes the truth arrives just in time to stop a mistake from becoming permanent. And that night, standing on the porch of the house Daniel built, I realized our family still had a chance to rebuild something real. Later that night, after the last car left the driveway, Alex and I sat on the porch. The garden lights were still glowing under the oak trees, the same trees Rebecca once imagined would mark the beginning of her victory. For a while we didn't speak. Then Alex said quietly, she thought she was marrying into an inheritance. I nodded, yes. He looked across the fields, the diner's lights faint in the distance along the highway. All those years you and Dad built this, and I almost handed it away. I placed my hand on the railing Daniel installed decades ago. People think inheritance is about money, I said. But it isn't. Alex looked at me. It's about responsibility. The wind moved softly through the trees. Money doesn't change people, I told him. It just reveals who they already are. So now I'm curious. If you had been sitting at that table the night Rebecca called me low-class trash, what would you have done? And tell me one thing. Do you think Alex truly learned his lesson?
Your voice matters here. Share your story below. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Have you ever lived through something similar? Share in the comments. Your voice matters here.